This session is entitled The Habit of Writing Poetry. I'm Pastor Andrew Richard. I'm assistant pastor, headmaster, and one of the upper-level teachers at Mount Hope Lutheran Church and School in Casper, Wyoming. I love writing poetry. Hymns, poems, that's what does it for me. And I like encouraging other people to write poetry too, and that's what this session is about. So if you thought this was a history of poetry or just a definition of poetry or an encouragement to read poetry, you should stick around anyway. But this is a session about how to write poetry yourself. What you learn in here, I hope you put into practice on your own, but you can also use it in the classroom or in a homeschool. Once a week in all three of my English classes, we do poetry composition in class, where I'll give the students a meter and they'll have to compose things during the 40-minute class session and read them aloud and get feedback. It's fun. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. I've written on the board some of the important works about poetics, both some of the ancient ones and some pertaining specifically to English. So, of course, we've got Aristotle's Poetics. We'll read some quotes from that as we go along. Horace's Ars Poetica. This one you'll probably want to acquire as a book, especially if it has good notes. This one you can find freely available online, translated. In fact, there are lots of translations of it. There are some that are put into English verse, in fact, though there's a nice prose translation of it available at poetryfoundation.com. You might want to write that down too, poetryfoundation.com. Good resource just for finding poems to read, though of course you have to be discerning. I will give you some recommended reading at the end to steer you in the right direction. We've got Plutarch, the same guy who did all the lives of the ancient Greeks and Romans. He wrote all kinds of treatises called the Moralia, where he teaches the same thing that he teaches through the lives, but just in didactic moral treatises. So the one here is How the Young Man Should Study Poetry. I did a quick check, and that is freely available in translation online if you search for it. You can also pick up the Loeb volume that has it in there as well, along with some other really good essays. Getting into English, we've got Sir Philip Sidney, The Defense of Poesy. He answers naysayers who try to make the claim that poetry does nothing but inculcate bad morals and teach vice. They're thinking specifically of the comedies of the stage, and he defends against that and upholds English poetry. And then George Puttenham, The Art of English Poesy, which is a wonderful read. He gets a little into defending poesy, but also defines it, talks about the different kinds, talks about the different English meters, talks about rhetorical figures, kind of one-stop shopping for everything you would want to know about English poetry. I will hold up some books at the end for where to find that one. I suppose the initial question that I should answer is, why write poetry? Why would you come sit down on a session about how to do this? Why would I want to write poetry in the first place? My first argument is that it's human. I think we've all been at some point in life where we find that plain words are just not good enough. They fail us, or they do not meet the moment or the emotion, the event, the right way. The words deserve to be dressed up better given what we're treating. So you think of when the Lord presented Eve to Adam. Adam did not speak in prose in that moment. He spoke poetry. When Israel crossed the Red Sea and the Lord delivered them from the hand of the Egyptians, it was not enough for Moses to stand up and give some declamation about what had just happened. They sang. It's the first song recorded in Scripture. It demanded poetry. Plain words would not have suited that moment. We could look at the inscriptions in the Psalms, how David, at various points in his life, or later reflecting on various points in his life, writes psalms specific to that time. He doesn't write some autobiographical commentary on, boy, it was rough when I was going through this. He writes poems, and he writes poems to the choir master, meaning for the cantor, for the one who oversees public worship. because what he was able to say about that moment, that event, as far as the hand of God was concerned, was more than just what he needed to know. It was what all Israel needed to know. And poetry made that available to all. We could look at some of our hymns. A New Song Now Shall Be Begun by Martin Luther. Not necessarily in the hymnal. It was a hymn written upon the occasion of the first two martyrs of the Reformation. And it was written in sort of this ballad form to make it widely available and accessible to people. And more than simply a rant or a treatise that people probably wouldn't have read, he spoke in poetry in a way that people could sing it, memorize it, recite it, and in a way that would simply delight them more than just reading prose on a page. We think of the hymn, If Thou But Suffer God to Guide Thee. That has an interesting story behind it, of a young man who had gone out from his home to seek his way in the world and was not able to find employment, ended up at an inn, hoping that he could, in exchange for some labor, be allowed to sleep in the stable. And as he's talking with the innkeeper, a man overhears him and has been looking for a tutor for his children, buys him supper, says, I've been searching far and wide for somebody, and I think you're that guy. You're not sleeping in the stable. You're coming home with me tonight. You've got a job. I've got a room all ready to go because I've been looking for a tutor. It's yours. And he goes to that room that night instead of sleeping in the stable. And there's a desk and a pen. And he sits down and writes, If Thou But Suffer God to Guide Thee. Because sitting down and writing plain words after that would not have done. So that's the first reason. To write poetry is human. Life calls for it. God calls for it. Another reason for writing poetry is that it makes you think deeply. You cannot have superficial thought when you have to so very carefully choose every single word that you are going to put on the page. And that means you need to know very clearly what it is you are going to be saying or trying to communicate. One poem jumped out at me as particularly illustrative of this, and that is by Anne Bradstreet. She wrote a poem called Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, July 10th, 1666. And she was one of the first female American poets, and one of the greatest female poets. I'll list all the males later. I'm not a feminist, but this one jumped out at me. I'll read the second half of it to you. As she walks past the burnt remains of her home, this is what she's reflecting on. Under thy roof no guest shall sit, nor at thy table eat a bit. No pleasant talk shall here be told, nor things recounted done of old. No candle e'er shall shine in thee, nor bridegroom's voice e'er heard shall be. In silence ever shalt thou lie, adieu, adieu, all's vanity. Then straight I 'gin my heart to chide. And did thy wealth on earth abide? Didst fix thy hope on mouldering dust? The arm of flesh didst make thy trust? Raise up thy thoughts above the sky, that dunghill mists away may fly. Thou hast a house on high erect, framed by that mighty architect. With his glory richly furnished, stands permanent, though this be fled. It's purchased and paid for, too, by him who hath enough to do. A price so vast as is unknown, yet by his gift is made thine own. There's wealth enough, I need no more. Farewell my pelf, farewell my store. The world no longer let me love. My hope and treasure lies above. Poetry makes you think deeply. A Christian could not just sit down and write a lament over my burnt house and just have something of a funeral sermon for a bunch of burnt timber. The Christian has to take it a different way, and thinking that deeply and having to put it to meter and choose exactly the right words to fit it makes you think, it's more than just a house. And why am I so broken up about this? Poetry is a great way for processing conflicting emotions, for purposefully sitting down and thinking, what does God's word have to say about this? And thinking as a Christian. So poetry is human. Writing poetry makes you think deeply. And then third, writing poetry will make you a better writer overall because it teaches you the art of rejection. And this is an actual art that is key to any type of writing. I remember the first time I knew what I wanted to say in a poem. I had it all outlined. I wrote it out, and I did not like it. It fit the meter. It mostly said what I wanted to say, but it wasn't good. And I remember the pain of having to pick up my pen, the pen that I had held for the last hour as I wrote this, and taking the same pen that made those words on the page and using that pen to cross them all out and start over again. Poetry teaches you the art of rejection, saying, I need this word, not that word. This word is the right number of syllables. This word fits the rhyme scheme. This word fits the field of talk in which I'm dealing and isn't extraneous to my subject matter. This word and no other will do, and I reject all other words for this spot in this poem. And that's a great art to be a master of when it comes to any form of communication. I would add that another form of study or exercise that really sharpens that skill is translation, where you have to take something from, say, Latin and put it into coherent English, capturing as much of what the person originally said as possible. That's another great way to learn the art of rejection. But that's not poetry. We'll get back to the matter at hand. Now, I told you this isn't about defining poetry, but we can't really go on unless we actually do. So let's talk about the simple question, what is poetry? We go all the way back to Aristotle's Poetics to begin answering this question. And I would ask you to turn in your handout to that first page of poetry quotes. Here are a couple of key excerpts from Aristotle's Poetics that get quoted again and again in the history of the study of poetry. Aristotle writes, epic poetry and the composition of tragedy, as well as comedy and the arts of dithyrambic poetry, and for the most part of music for pipe and lyre, are all taken together imitations. Mimesis is what he calls them. And as far as what he means by that, he means being true to reality, representing things rightly and accurately. He sort of laments in the next quote, admittedly, people attach poetry to the name of the verse form, and thus refer to elegiac poets and hexameter poets. That is, they do not call people poets because they produce imitations, but indiscriminately on the basis of their use of verse. Now that's gotten some later poets into trouble, where they've said, see, Aristotle says that poetry doesn't have to have anything to do with verse. And you get someone like Sir Philip Sidney pointing to Xenophon's Sarapaideia, the sort of upbringing of Cyrus, where he says, see, he's created this character, it's an imitation of reality, but it's in prose, so let's call it a poem. And he has kind of a hard time making that case. All the examples that Aristotle uses are in verse. There are many who lament that, sort of with Aristotle here, that when people think poetry, they think meter and what type of meter you're using. In English, we have that same problem with rhyme. And when you get to these guys, you get that same type of thing. Or John Milton, we'll read an excerpt from him, where he laments that when people think poetry, they just think rhyme. And that the ancient poets, Homer and so forth, Virgil, did not use rhyme. So rhyme is not the sine qua non of poetry. It's not the thing that if you take it away, it ceases to be poetry. Rather, we would say that meter is. We'll get into more detail with that in a moment. George Puttenham goes sort of the etymological route in defining poetry. He says a poet is as much to say a maker. And our English name well conforms with the Greek word for of poiein, to make, they call a maker poeta. Such as, by way of resemblance and reverently, we may say of God, who without any travail to his divine imagination made all the world of naught, nor also by any pattern or mold, as the Platonics with their ideas do fantastically suppose. Even so, the very poet makes and contrives out of his own brain both the verse and matter of his poem, and not by any foreign copy or example, as doth the translator, who therefore may well be said a versifier, but not a poet. The premise is considered, it giveth to the name of and profession no small dignity and preeminence above all other artificers, scientific or mechanical. And nevertheless, without any repugnancy at all, a poet may in some sort be said a follower or imitator, because he can express the true and lively of everything is set before him, and which he taketh in hand to describe, and so in that respect is both a maker and a counterfeiter, and poesy and art not only of making, but also of imitation. That's one of the best definitions of the poet that I've come across that approaches it from an etymological standpoint. In fact, the Scots, I think to this day, still call their poets makars, M-A-K-A-R. And there's a very famous poem by William Dunbar called Lament for the Macaris, where he writes sort of this dirge lamenting the death of all the great poets who had come before him, like Geoffrey Chaucer, for example. Milton's introduction to Paradise Lost that he appended after he got some initial reaction from people about it, people were complaining of Paradise Lost that it didn't rhyme, so it's not poetry, right? You're all familiar with Paradise Lost? Have at least heard of it? Yeah. Written in blank verse, so unrhyming iambic pentameter throughout. And Milton was fed up with this feedback that he was getting because he was so well-versed in the ancient poets. In fact, the first poetry that Milton wrote was in Greek and Latin because he learned it in school. He learned to write poetry from studying Greek and Latin poets. And the first poetry he wrote was in Greek and Latin as he practiced with those meters. So if you get a collected poetical works of John Milton, that's what you'll find at the beginning if it's arranged chronologically. But he had this to say concerning Paradise Lost. The measure is English heroic verse without rhyme, as that of Homer in Greek and Virgil in Latin, rhyme being no necessary adjunct or true ornament of poem or good verse, in longer works especially, but the invention of a barbarous age to set off wretched matter and lame meter. Graced indeed since by the use of some famous modern poets carried away by custom, but much to their own vexation, hindrance, and constraint to express many things otherwise, and for the most part, worse than else they would have expressed them. He's talking about people bringing in subject matter that doesn't pertain to their subject matter just because a word rhymes. So they say much more than they would otherwise if they didn't feel so constrained by rhyme. Let's see here. Not without cause, therefore, some both Italian and Spanish poets of prime note have rejected rhyme both in longer and shorter works, as have also long since our best English tragedies, as a thing of itself, to all judicious ears trivial, and of no true musical delight, which consists only in apt numbers, fit quantity of syllables, and the sense variously drawn out from one verse into another, not in the jingling sound of like endings, a fault avoided by the learned ancients both in poetry and all good oratory. So there he hits on meter as the thing that if you take it away, it's not poetry anymore. That means it's the sine qua non, without which not. The thing you remove it and it isn't anymore. You take meter away, you've got prose. You do not have poetry. So he talks about apt numbers, fit quantity of syllables. This has to do with something written or spoken being metrical. This neglect then of rhyme so little is to be taken for a defect, though it may seem so perhaps to vulgar readers, that it rather is to be esteemed an example set, the first in English of ancient liberty recovered to heroic poem from the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming. Now that being said, I will address rhyming in poetry. Frankly, even though rhyming is not necessary to calling something poetry, it is incredibly common, and I would say that we as Lutherans make the best use of it with our hymnody. Rhyme can be used as a catechetical device for making something memorable. Right? Kind of like in the Psalms, you'll find certain psalms laid out as acrostics, where each line begins with successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So also rhyme can help bring to mind what the next line is and aid the memory. So in teaching good Lutheran hymns to our children, I would say rhyme is certainly not to be despised, but actually aids not just the act of trying to instill it in a child's mind, but actually aids the poetry itself. You're free to disagree with me. Now, in issuing this definition, what did I do with my marker? May it rest in peace wherever it is. No, I put it on the podium so I wouldn't lose track of it. All right, I'm going to erase this. If you didn't copy it down, too bad. So I suppose to make this simply into a diagram, here's meter. We would say here's poetry, and then here's rhyme. So some poetry is going to rhyme. All poetry is going to be metrical. Not all metrical things are going to be poetry, because not all metrical things are going to be imitations, according to Aristotle's definition of fitting in with what is reality and accurately representing the way things are, or representing a thing as it actually is. You could lie in meter, for example, and it would not correspond to reality and would therefore not be a true imitation or poetry then, properly speaking, if we accept Aristotle's definition. So this is the way that I've come to think about it, and the majority of English poetry will fit into this category right here, where it rhymes, it follows meter, and it actually does represent something that we find to be true as we look at it. All right. Let's see here. As far as getting started with writing poetry yourself, I will spend the rest of the time on this. There's a guy named George Gascoigne. He wrote in 1575 Certain Notes of Instruction, and it's the briefest little treatise on how to go about writing poetry. He has 16 main points that he goes through, and I'll cover many of those as we go along. But his first one that I didn't see elsewhere, but is key before you even start, is having in mind what you want to say and what your general outline and structure is going to be. He puts it this way: "Thus much I adventure to deliver unto you, my friend, upon the rule of invention, which of all other rules is most to be marked and hardest to be prescribed in certain and infallible rules. Nevertheless, to conclude therein, I would have you stand most upon the excellency of your invention, and stick not to study deeply for some fine device," meaning don't make your poetry just about how many rhetorical devices you can cram in, but about some concept that's going to harmoniously hold the whole thing together. For that invention being found, pleasant words will follow well enough and fast enough. So an example of this, Edmund Spenser's famous poem, the Epithalamion, that he wrote for his wife as a wedding gift. At the end, he has this really humble little concluding poem about how he couldn't afford jewelry, so I wrote you this poem instead. And it's becoming one of the most glorious and well-known poems in the history of English poetry. He structured it according to the 24 hours of his wedding day, and under each hour talks about what would be going on during that hour as he foresaw it going. So he's got a lot about nature, before the world has sort of woken up for the day, and the birds heralding the day and so forth. He goes through the whole church ceremony and what happens later in a pious way. But that was his invention, his structure, overarching concept to make the whole thing cohesive, and that it made sense that I went to that line from the one before it, because that's naturally what would have followed given my invention. Right. Interesting, that poem also has 365 lines in it. Yeah, it's really fascinating how he plays with numbers in that poem. I've written quite a bit of poetry. Some of it's been published in Christian Culture. I'm not sure how many of you are receiving that magazine. Yeah, that's far too few hands. You need to go to cc.lutherclassical.org and subscribe. It's free. You can get a hard copy in your mailbox for free. But that always includes some poetry in it as well. And I try to think through invention as well as I go through things. So I wrote one poem called Aeterna Pax Jesu, the eternal peace of Jesus. And the main structure for it is going through saints in the Old Testament who, from our human perspective, had reason to be hopeless and yet weren't. And each stanza of it, there are 18 stanzas in all, picks a character from the Old Testament, talks about his situation and how he did not lose hope, but confessed, Aeternam pacem Jesu habeo, and it's the Latin in the last line, I have the eternal peace of Jesus. And then after going through a bunch of Old Testament and into the New Testament characters, ending with kind of, why should I be despairing then, right? But that was the invention for it, sort of the method, the concept that was going to unite the whole thing. And that is going to determine what sorts of rhetorical devices you would use or wouldn't use, what field of vocabulary is or isn't going to fit with your invention. For instance, even if the word lawnmower were like the perfect word, to end a line, I would not use it because it doesn't fit my subject matter or have anything to do with my invention. So this gets into the art of rejection again, that you're not just going to reject words because they aren't the right number of syllables or don't follow the rhyme scheme. You're also going to reject them because they have nothing to do with what you're talking about or have a connotation that does not fit what you're trying to say. Right? So you'd be surprised when you set out how often you go searching for the right word. And when you find it, you know it, and there's one, and there's no other. Right? And sometimes you have to reject whole lines or whole stanzas just because you find the one right word you need, and it doesn't fit your meter or doesn't fit your rhyme scheme. So you've got to go back and get rid of a bunch of stuff to make it fit where it's supposed to. So that's the first thing, invention. You're all familiar with iambic pentameter. Yes, the concept of iambic pentameter. So an iamb is what's called a poetic foot. And the iamb is the main one in English. You also have the trochee that comes up in enough poems. Actually quite a few of our Lutheran hymns, a line will end with a trochee. So like, dear Christians, one and all rejoice. But an iamb is an unaccented syllable followed by an accented syllable. So that right there is your iamb. If you string 5 of them together, that's your penta. So iambic pentameter is the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And that is the cadence of much English poetry. I would say if you're getting into poetry, start there. Don't jump into, I want to do something anapestic, like, 'twas the night before Christmas and all through the house. It has that sort of galloping feel, or Paul Revere's Ride, or the Destruction of Sennacherib. Right? But start with iambic pentameter. I've got a handout here, Introduction to Iambic Pentameter, where it goes through just sort of giving you a feel for that meter. I'll take questions at the end. Mostly I'm just pointing out to you what's in this packet, because in large part you can pick up at whatever point you feel your instruction needs to start with this and kind of read through it. I tried to write out as much as possible for you. So some examples from George Herbert, excellent poet, and St. Crispin's Day speech from King Henry V. Turn to the page General Rules of Stress in Poetry. So I've got this line of iambic pentameter alternating unaccented and accented syllables. Something that the English poetic books, for instance, George Puttenham, along with many others, something they stress is not using long words. They were really unnatural to English at that time because they were still feeling the, even though it was 500 years later, still getting used to the Norman invasion and all these, Latinate words that came into English. So they called that like dirtying yourself with the inkhorn if you used too many Latin words that were more natural to writing and sounding fancy than they were to just normal English speech. Anglo-Saxon, they contend, had many more just single-syllable words in it. So they say to gravitate toward single-syllable words. Now, with multi-syllable words, rules of stress are really easy. You just take the natural emphasis of a word. Say I've got the word shepherd. That would be shepherd, like that. Well, I can line that word shepherd up, say there, or there, or there, or there, but I cannot start the line with it if I want my stresses to line up correctly. I need to line up the natural emphasis of this multi-syllable word with my meter. That one's pretty straightforward. You can read through examples on the page. The most important words in any form of communication are your nouns and verbs. You're going to want to give them the stress. So as you go through figuring out, what do I put on a stressed syllable? What do I not put on a stressed syllable? Especially when you're not in a case like this where it's kind of easy and tells you. If you've got a bunch of one-syllable words, you want to put your nouns and your verbs on your stressed syllables. The kind of one exception to that is the verb be, because usually what's most important is your predicate nominative, the thing that comes after it. Right? So that's what you'll want to stress in that case. But other nouns and verbs you want on your stressed syllables. There are some examples there of how to line things up. So looking at the example there under Roman numeral 2, letter A, he makes his sheep to rest in fields of grass. So you've got makes and sheep and rest and fields and grass all lining up with the accented syllables, and it feels natural. Let's flip that around. All right, look at B at the top of the next page. So if I have sheep in fields of grass, he makes to rest there. If I just say it, I mean, it sounds kind of convoluted, but if I try lining that up with the meter, then I get something like sheep in fields of grass, he makes to rest there. And all the words that are not important are stressed, right? Again, you want to put your nouns and your verbs on your stressed syllables, and unimportant words you want unstressed. In Roman numeral 3 of that particular handout, I outline what things to avoid stressing. Letter A under that, simply put, don't stress modifiers and helping words. So adjectives, adverbs, articles, and possessive pronouns are kind of the worst. Stressing the or that doesn't add anything to what you're saying. It's just grammatically necessary for it to be there so that you don't sound like Tarzan or Yoda, right? So internalize that rules of stress handout. Now, I almost forgot to append the rhyming handout. I did remember to print it, and I stapled it at the back, so that is not in order. But flip to the last handout in your packet entitled Rhyming in Poetry. Something I really want to stress is do not use a rhyming dictionary. The devil invented rhyming dictionaries. Pop singers use rhyming dictionaries. That should tell you something. You don't want to be like pop singers or write poetry like pop singers. The practice that I outline on this handout for how to find rhyming words was something that just sort of came naturally to me as I started writing poetry. I actually started writing poetry when I was a kid. I always have a hard time falling asleep, and so that's when I started doing it, just sort of playing with words in my head as I lay there trying to fall asleep. And so this sort of process is just sort of internalized now, and you want to do the same sort of thing for finding rhymes. I come to find out that George Gascoigne, who wrote the Certain Rules of Instruction in 1575, outlines the exact same process for finding rhymes. So if you won't take it on my authority, you can take it on his. You've got listed out all your consonants and all your 2-letter blends, along with some of the 3-letter blends toward the bottom. Note that there are 2 th sounds in English, the voiced and the unvoiced. You've got the unvoiced, the th, as in thing, and you have the voiced th, as in the word the or this, right? So be sure to try out both of those as you're going about rhyming. So the example I have here, let's say I'm trying to rhyme with the word go. You just take your final vowel sound, O, and you try out all of these consonants and blends at the beginning of it. And you just rattle down the list. So you've got go laid out there. Let's do something else. How about me? So you always try just the sound itself, because sometimes that is a word. So E, then you go down the list. B, key, D, E, F, G, He, G, Key, Li, Mi, Ni, P, Qui, Re, Si, T, V, We, Ye, Z. And then your 2-letter blends. Blee, bree, chi, clee, cree, dree, dwee, flee, free, glee, glee, flee, pre, she, ski, slee, smee, snee, spee, squee, stee, swee, thee, thee, tree, twee. And then you can go on to your 3-letter blends if you want. As you go through that process, you write down the words. As you're starting out, you can write down all of them, and you'll find out just how many words don't exist in English that could. Most of this process I just do in my head. So as I'm going through, I'll say them to myself, and then I'll just write down the ones that are actual words that actually have something to do with what I'm talking about. And I leave out the ones that aren't words. I leave out the words that have nothing to do with what I'm saying. And then usually if I've got a line of poetry and I've ended with a word, I'll if I'm having a hard time coming up with a rhyme, I'll go through this process. I'll jot down all the ones that are possibilities next to it. And then when it's time to rhyme, I'll look at that list in advance, so I'm not just sticking in a random word as I get to, I've got one syllable left, which one am I going to put in there? How about this one? But you have to plan grammatically how this is going to work. I didn't put this anywhere on the handouts, but grammar still matters. You can be freer with it as a poet, omitting certain words or eliding letters, turning adjectives into adverbs. There's fun to be had, but it does still have to be grammatically correct. That's one of the problems I'll run into with students who I'll have them write a single sentence over the course of an iambic pentameter quatrain, and having to stretch a thought over the 40 syllables with 2 different end rhymes. Usually the first mistake that's made is just, well, since I've got to pay attention to so much other stuff, hang grammar. No, it still matters. So always keep that in mind. Go ahead and turn to the handout, Couplets of Iambic Pentameter. That's after the general rules of stress in poetry. So you can get familiar with writing single lines of iambic pentameter. If you want to practice rhyming, the logical starting place is writing a couplet. That'd be 2 lines of iambic pentameter that rhyme at the end. Now, the couplet itself is a poetic form, and you'll actually find them, even by famous poets written. One of my favorite ones is by John Donne, about 2/3 of the way down the list. I am unable, yonder beggar cries, to stand or move. If he say true, he lies. Which is I teach that one to the students too, to help them distinguish between lie and lay, which is an important distinction to make, along with not using they as a gender-neutral singular pronoun. Right? Yes. All right, go ahead and flip to we're going to skip a few handouts. Getting into the habit of writing poetry. The other handouts I'm going to leave to your reading. They're pretty self-explanatory and have plenty of examples on them, so I think you're well on your way. If you understand what's been going on so far. So getting into the habit of writing poetry. So the first thing to do is read a lot of good poetry. If you aren't taking it in and seeing how it's supposed to work, it's just going to be frustrating trying to manufacture it yourself. The poet is a maker. And in all arts where you have to make something, you need to learn from somebody else, preferably a master. You apprentice yourself to somebody so that you can learn how this craft is supposed to be done, what my end product is supposed to look like if I'm doing it right. So I might watch a master carpenter make a cabinet, and I might see, oh, okay, that's how that goes. And I'll watch another one make a totally different cabinet. Say, okay, I understand a little more now. And then I might set out to make a cabinet, and it might not look exactly like either of theirs, right? But if I take what I've learned from them and apply it rightly, it can still be good of its own right. Remember, a poet is a maker. So you are inventing something as you do this. It's not just... I guess the other thing would be what, copy work? Where I take a poem of John Milton and just write it down on my own paper, right? That's not poetry. But learning from him and then making something myself, that would be poetry. So read a lot of good poetry. I have some recommendations written at the bottom there. I'll hold up a couple of books now. There's the New Oxford Book of 16th Century Verse. If you own only one book of poetry, I would get this one. All right, the New Oxford Book of 16th Century Verse. You move beyond the 16th century, and well, I shouldn't lump everybody in the 17th century into the same category because you've got Ben Jonson and George Herbert. So. Not everyone in the 17th century is bad, but you start to get a whole lot more poetry that is simply unchristian. And that gets worse and worse as things go on. So something of the golden age of poetry is the 16th century, at least in English. There's the New Oxford Book of 17th Century Verse. I would move this one down your list as far as picking it up. Still good to have, but not utterly necessary. The covers, if you go looking for them, are not going to look like this. They're paperbacks now and totally redesigned cover, but same name. As far as particular poets, if you were to get one book by one particular poet, it would be George Herbert. So George Herbert's The Complete Poetry is a great volume. He sounds pretty Lutheran. Most of his poems are Christian poems. Another great poet is John Donne. If you start reading this book at the beginning, you'll think, why did Pastor Richard recommend this guy? He sort of re-embraced Christianity partway through his life. And so his later poetry is significantly better and Christian than the earlier stuff. There are different volumes of John Milton, but find something, the complete poetical works of John Milton. That's good stuff too. So read good poetry. Then start by writing single lines of iambic pentameter, just to get used to how words are supposed to line up with that particular meter. You can leave off in the middle of a sentence if you want. Just get used to lining up the words with the meter. Then work on trying to say a cohesive thought, a complete sentence in those 10 syllables. Keep reading lots of good poetry. Then try writing couplets, where you're doing 2 lines of iambic pentameter and making them rhyme at the end. In some ways, this is more difficult because you have to rhyme. In some ways, it's easier because I've just doubled the amount of land I have to work with, so to speak, and I'm at 20 syllables. And it can be a whole lot easier to say something in 20 syllables than in 10. So if you're having a hard time coming up with a cohesive thought doing a single line of iambic pentameter, just do sentence fragments. Get used to lining up words with the meter the right way. And move on to couplets. You can practice rhyming. You have a little more territory to work with there, and things might go more smoothly. You can reference that couplets sheet for sort of examples of what people have done with the couplet form in English over the years. After you've done couplets of iambic pentameter, keep reading lots of good poetry. Then practice writing quatrains. There are 2 patterns of quatrains. Almost fooled myself again. So if you picture 4 lines of this, you can follow the A-B pattern, where these ones would rhyme at the end and these ones would rhyme at the end. Or you can follow the A-B-B-A pattern, where you have this inside-outside rhyme scheme at the end of those lines. Then keep reading lots of good poetry. You can try a rhyme royal stanza after you try the quatrain. That's a lot of fun to play around with. Chaucer wrote Troilus and Cressida in rhyme royal stanzas. Some of the Canterbury Tales stanzas, like the story of Constance, is written in rhyme royal stanzas. There's a handout on there about the rhyme royal form with plenty of examples for you to look at. It has 7 lines. It follows an A, B, A, B, B, C, C pattern, and it's all iambic pentameter. You can look up any of the poems that are listed here and find other examples. For example, On the Morning of Christ's Nativity by John Milton would be a great one, somebody to look up on the Poetry Foundation website and read the whole thing and get a feel for how you use multiple rhyme royal stanzas together. If you've gotten this far and you're writing rhyme royal stanzas, then the world opens up to you. And you can attempt any of the following in whatever order you choose. You can write a ballad stanza, 8 lines of iambic pentameter, following the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C. There are lots of poems that use that. It was a favorite of William Dunbar's. My poem, I Turn a Pax Jesu, follows that ballad stanza through. It's also sometimes called the Monk's Tale stanza because Chaucer used it in the Monk's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. So you can, if you find a good translation of the Canterbury Tales that maintains his rhyme scheme and meter, you can read it that way too and get a feel for it. You can just play around with blank verse, and I didn't put that on there. Blank verse is like William Shakespeare or John Milton's Paradise Lost, where it's in iambic pentameter, there's just no rhyming going on. Sentences freely carry over from line to line, So I might say part of a sentence and finish it off with the first 3 syllables of the next line, and then start another sentence for 7 syllables and either end it or wrap around again. So there's plenty of that going on in both Shakespeare and Milton. If you want to get into blank verse or just really instill the iambic pattern in your head, I recommend reading Paradise Lost out loud. Another way of going about it is find good audio productions of Shakespeare's plays and follow along with the script as you're listening to it. Those are 2 great ways for getting into blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. You can write a sonnet. The sonnet form is very specific, and in fact encompasses 4 pages of the handout called Sonnets. It's got plenty of examples there, outlines the 3 main sonnet forms. That's a good place to jump. You end up with 14 lines of iambic pentameter, 3 different choices, main ones anyway in English, of rhyme scheme, and a nice limitation placed on you. In fact, I think it was William Wordsworth. I may have even included this sonnet in here, called Nuns Fret Not at Their Convent's Narrow Room. Yeah, I did. That's a sonnet about the sonnet form. So if you want some encouragement, you can hear it from Wordsworth. You could try writing a longer piece using multiple rhyme royal or ballad stanzas. That's been popular in the English language, very much popularized by Chaucer. You can write a story using heroic couplets. There's a handout on the heroic couplet. That's rhyming couplets of iambic pentameter. Very famously, Alexander Pope translated the Iliad and the Odyssey into English heroic verse. John Dryden did the same for the Aeneid. I had my students do that for doing an epic retelling of Little Red Riding Hood as an English assignment. After we had finished reading the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid that year, I made that one of their English assignments. And they had some fun stuff where they'd give like the lineage of a weapon and and how it passed on from this person to that person, where the huntsman got his axe from. One student even had the huntsman accidentally kill Little Red Riding Hood, and then in Hercules style descend to the underworld, fight Hades, and get her back. But the heroic form lends itself to that sort of thing. You can also play around with using a hymn meter. If you want to get into hymn writing, one of the best starting points is with long meter. It's like a quatrain, but you have 1 less foot on each line. So it's 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 8 syllables, following a variety of patterns, usually A, B, A, B. But you can give that a try. And then you can even look up what tunes follow that meter in the back of the hymnal, and then sing your poem. You also realize that certain poems fit tunes in the hymnal that you wouldn't expect. Like you can sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to the tune of Savior of the Nations Come. The metrical index in the back of both LSB and TLH will be helpful just in discovering what the popular meters are for English hymnody. Though a lot of the German tunes end lines with trochees, and I didn't really get into that. That's something you can look up on your own, I suppose. And you can also just make up whatever meter you want, as long as once you've chosen a meter, you stick with it and don't violate it as you go along. George Putnam lists that as one of the marks of like a bad novice poet, is that he sets out following the meter and then, say the next stanza, he violates it immediately. How are we doing on time? No, we're over. That's too bad. If you would like a good book about poetry with some historic works in it, I would recommend just one volume, and that is from the Penguin Classics series. It's Sidney's The Defense of Poesy and Selected Renaissance Literary Criticism. So you will get Sidney in here. You'll get George Putnam's Art of English Poesy in slightly reduced form in there. You can find that one in full on its own if you want. You get George Gascoigne's Certain Notes of Instruction on how to begin writing poetry, all kinds of good stuff in that single volume. And the ISBN of all of these are listed out there. All right. Whew.